Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Getting to Better Together, our podcast mini-series sponsored by the Centre for International Development, Social Entrepreneurship and Leadership, CIDSL as we call ourselves at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and I am your host Richard Borden. Before proceeding, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. The world in which we've been living since the end of the Cold War is, as we've been told by the world of business especially, a VUCA world, V-U-C-A, an environment characterised by volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. While this is a neat little acronym, it's composed of a strange set of concepts or ideas which in the first place can be mutually exclusive of each other, which is rather counter to the whole point of an acronym, but never mind. Some situation or another that's volatile is not necessarily complex, and just because issues promote a sense of uncertainty doesn't mean that it's inherently ambiguous, and so on. But more importantly, these four words represent different phenomena. Volatility and complexity are basically descriptions of what are being perceived as the actual state of affairs or things, while uncertainty and ambiguity are essentially human reactions to those. The changing climate, for instance, presents an environment that is certainly volatile and complex. It's clearly associated with rapid and unpredictable changes in weather events, for instance, and many having extreme social as well as environmental impacts. And there's no doubt that these matters are complex in that they involve interactions, interrelationships, and interactions as interconnections between so many different variables that often lead to unexpected and invariably unpredictable outcomes, which are referred to as emergent. While reactions to these phenomena can certainly induce senses of uncertainty and ambiguity, these are not particularly useful responses with respect to what needs to be done in the face of issues that are volatile and complex. Fortunately, there's an increasing appreciation by those responsible for public policy, as well as corporate and institutional leadership, that our traditional ways of approaching such issues, our conventional ways of thinking and acting, as it were, are no longer adequate in helping us to deal with these critical and urgent challenges. There are calls for what's being referred to as systems thinking, or systems approaches, or for holistic practices as new ways of approaching volatile and complex issues and situations. It's not unusual for systems thinking to be one of the competencies for those seeking management and leadership positions in both public as well as private sectors these days. But what's actually meant by these calls? There are few more qualified people than my guest today to address and shed light on these issues. Ray Eisen is a very distinguished systems scholar, academic, researcher and innovative educator, as well as being a prolific writer and author. He is the Professor of Emeritus within the Applied Systems and Thinking Practice group at the Open University in the UK. He's a past president of the International Society for the Systems Sciences, among other international leadership positions that he's held over the years. Welcome, Ray. Let me start with two very basic questions. The first, what do you understand as systems thinking?
Well, thanks, Richard. I want to start this conversation by referring to the notion of relationship. Relationality is central and underpinning of what I will claim is systems thinking, or at least what people refer to when they aspire to engage in systems thinking. We live in a world of relations and relationships, but we've developed ways of thinking and ways of institutionalising our lives which often impoverish the nature of those relationships. And to think in terms of relationships through the adage that everything is connected to something else or everything else doesn't help us get very far in trying to act purposefully to change the world around us. So But most people actually don't know how relationships function, particularly in the social world and the biophysical world. And we are stuck in one pattern of relationship which has become counterproductive or inappropriate to our contemporary circumstances. So let me start with a little anecdote or an exemplar of how relationship unfolds in my view. So if we take the phenomenon of swimming, it could be us, it could be a fish, it could be any organism, then for swimming as an action, as a practice to happen, it requires the relational dynamics between an organism, say us, with a body, and a medium, which is the water or whatever it happens to be that we're swimming in. And if you break down that relationship between the organism and the water, then swimming as a phenomenon or as a practice doesn't happen. And so these relational dynamics are always being enacted in all of our living in different forms and fashions and other things of that nature.
Right.
And we've fallen into a trap of thinking not in relationships in terms of how swimming happens, which I would clarify as a systemic relationship, to take one word from the concept system. We've fallen into a trap of thinking that relationships only happen in linear cause-effect ways. So someone shoots a bullet, it kills someone. So effect, cause, etc.
Right.
And this has led me in my work to make the distinction between systemic thinking and systematic thinking, systemic thinking in practice and systematic thinking in practice. And we live in a world dominated by the linear model that underpins systematic cause and effect thinking.
Right.
And that served us well for a period of time that was relatively benign biologically and socially, but has never really delivered the sorts of outcomes that we could have had if we were to have invested more in systemic thinking. And as a slight aside, interestingly, as we engage more with indigenous understandings around the globe, we encounter the disparate nature between the Western intellectual tradition and those traditions of understanding which are inherently more systemic compared to where we have arrived at in the Western canon of thought. So systems thinking combines both thinking systemically in terms of relationships that are circular, have feedback processes that operate in the manner that I exemplified through swimming, and systematic relationships operate in simple cause and effect thinking, and I would argue are only a very special case of our circumstances and our contemporary circumstances, despite the fact that it is the dominant mode of being and acting in the world. So if you just reflect on us as humans for a moment, we humans have been constructed through economic thought and Homo economicus and other things as being individuals with complete autonomy or with freedom and these sorts of concepts. Yet we humans are inextricably involved in relationship. We can't exist outside relationship. Roughly 50% of our DNA is non-human DNA. We are inextricably coupled to our environment through the air we breathe, the circumstances we need for living, and as an exemplar to perhaps go back to the VUCA claims, as climate change impacts us more, then the quality of our living, the relationship between us and the world we inhabit, is breaking down and getting worse. And we can't resolve that through linear cause and effect thinking. So
could it be argued that had we had that sort of notion, if we grasped this notion of relationality much earlier on, then we wouldn't have got ourselves into this situation?
Well, I believe, yes, we've subjugated that in the rise of the conduct of Western science, and we lost track of. It's not that there hasn't been people advocating these ways of thinking for long periods of time,
Right.
you amongst them and I amongst them. But the dominant paradigm that's become institutionalized in the Western canon has been the linear model and the systematic model at the expense of the systemic. And so
Right.
we've operated, particularly since the Second World War, in ways that have what I would claim is we've taken us into a co-evolutionary trajectory. A co-evolutionary trajectory is the relational dynamics between humans and the remainder of the biosphere, including other species. And so we are constantly in a co-evolving, changing dynamic and heading in particular directions. And the direction we're heading in as a result of that commitment to the systematic has got us on the wrong pathway. And we are now desperately trying to alter the pathway we're on, although whether we're doing it quickly enough is a very big question.
Now, if people have been thinking this way for a long time, and you and I know that they have, and as you say, Indigenous people don't even talk about it in those terms, it's just their way of being. If we need to sort of turn the ship around, to use a linear example, what do we have to do more than we have been doing over the last 40 or 50 years?
Well, I don't want to fall into a cause and effect answer. The answer is systemic, but my starting point is that we need to reflect on how we understand ourselves in the first instance, which means bringing a greater reflexivity to who we are and what we do, and to appreciate that we humans live in a network of what I call social technologies that have come to use us rather than us using them. It's becoming a little more apparent, perhaps, to people more generally because of the debate on AI at the moment.
Right.
But we can go back to basics, as I often do in workshops with students, and ask the question, how do they come to be doing what they're doing now, and to take them back to think about their evolutionary past and their cultural past and the culture and the language they are born into.
Right.
And in the Western intellectual tradition, we're born, particularly in the European tradition, we're born into languages that are noun-dominated, and we live a world as if objects existed prior to their distinction in language.
Right.
And I have a granddaughter who's just about to turn 2, and it's been fascinating to watch her development of language. And if you think about how we work with children through all sorts of means, by repetition, by relationship, by pointing, by drawing, to bring forth the idea that an individual can name that as porridge, or name it as an orange, or name it as some other object. And then after the child has developed that language to name the object and accept its naming, then we ditch all the processes that led to its distinction.
Yeah, so.
And we forget that it's that systemic relational unfolding that gave rise to the object. The object didn't exist prior to that. And this is the difference, I think, between many Indigenous languages, which are more verb-based, or other types of languages. So languages use people in different ways, and for that reason I call it a social technology, in the sense that it operates and mediates our relationship with our world. And a good example is the concept system. So if we go back to the idea of systems thinking, Well, systems is a noun in the English language. And as you and I know, for 50 years or more, the underpinning theories of knowledge that operate in the systems world are where some people think systems exist in the real world. They're things out there in the world, i.e. objects. And others choose to see systems as something we bring forth, or we formulate, or we conceptualize in a process that is not unlike how a young baby develops their language in the Western tradition. And so the concept system can be seen by some people as a thing, and by some people as a means of knowing about the world, a way of engaging with the world. And so one can say the concept system can be used systemically, or it can be used systematically.
It's all very confusing.
Well, it is in a way, yes. But we've built these traps for ourselves, and this is why I say that the first step is to become aware of how we ourselves have built these traps, and to begin to tear down the fences that sort of trap us in these ways of thinking and acting. And it becomes these ways of thinking have become built into rules and norms, to our public policy, to our economic systems, and to the rules by which we govern ourselves, which is why we're having so many problems, because the underpinning dynamic that's unfolding, whether it's in biodiversity loss, whether it's in adaptation to climate change, whether it's in social relations with each other and poverty and maldistribution of wealth, these are all systemic problems, which the early report to the Club of Rome back in 1969 called the Global Problematique, a set of 59 interconnecting problems. The Club of Rome accepted the report but didn't respond to it, and instead we had the work on the limits to growth, which was a systematic response to what was a systemic issue. And the world has fallen into that trap consistently since those periods in the 60s of responding systematically to what are systemic issues.
There's a very interesting backstory, which you probably know, about how the Club of Rome first approached an academic, or a couple of academics, to follow the notion of systems, or systemicity, in the sense of relationships again, as we said, and they actually rejected that and then moved to the model that describes reality, as you say. So it was a modelling approach, as if the world, and it was all pretty obvious. I mean, there was nothing really very clever about what it is that the Club of Rome eventually said in their report. And so from my point of view, there were two bits that were missing. The first bit was to say something that really was not very clever. It's pretty obvious. If you follow the fact that the populations keep increasing, they will continue to use resources and they'll run out. That's not particularly difficult to understand. What they missed out also then was the very thing you've been talking about. So they just prolonged the idea that if we kept thinking and acting the way that we have been to that point, then all will be well. I want to take up something from that perspective that I am particularly impressed with the work that you've been doing over decades, and that's your connection always with thinking and acting, or thinking and practice. Can you tell me a little bit about the extensive work that you did at the Open University with that linkage?
The Open University has taught systems approaches and systems thinking to generations of students for over 50 years. It's one of the longest established systems educators in the world, and we've had many mature age students study systems. When I arrived in 1994 and I arrived having, as Professor of Systems, I had used their material in my own teaching when we were together at Hawkesbury and when I was at the University of Sydney. So I was always impressed with their curriculum. But they had, to some extent, fallen into this trap of not distinguishing between systems as things in the world and systems as epistemologies. And what had been a reasonably viable program of within the context of the Open University became increasingly problematic because we weren't getting as much students, because the word system was increasingly interpreted in the late 90s as a computer.
Yes, that's right.
And so this became the embodiment in popular culture or popular language of what it was to think and act with the system. And so we thought about our circumstances and revised our curriculum, and we developed what we call the Systems Thinking in Practice program to make absolutely clear that the point that thinking is not divorced from practice. All these are systemically interconnected. One is not prime, one gives rise to the other, captured in the idea that all knowing is doing. It also helped us to break out of the trap of having people think that we are only concerned about computers. So we've built curricula, and we've now educated thousands of students who within our STIP program, which is built around how they might develop themselves as a reflexive practitioner engaged with the world and changing and developing their own understandings, working with others to change their understanding and practices, and taking responsibility for how they carry out their own practice in the situations they find themselves. We, after meeting many of our students, I discovered that a lot of them had done our programs, had been really enamoured, it had changed their lives quite profoundly, and but they'd often found they had to leave their work, or that they weren't valued. They weren't valued back in their workplace because
there's a familiar story.
They were running into conflict with others and things of this nature. So I coined the term design turn. We felt we had to build into our curriculum the capacity for our students to understand systems thinking in practice, to do it, but to also step up a level of understanding or abstraction, as we might call it, and to take a design turn so that they would actually consider the circumstances they were going to practice in.
Yeah.
Who the others were, who the people they were working with, what the rules were, how people, so that they could then not only do their practice but change the circumstances of their doing.
Yeah.
And that to me is really one of the great challenges of the current circumstances, because we're so the models that enhance the linear model are so entrenched that we've constantly got and it fights back because people don't understand any other way of doing it, and so we've got to constantly create secure beachheads of thinking and acting systemically in all of the different domains in which we carry out our work.
Ray, this has been delightful. Thank you so much for helping us understand the mysteries of systems, and what a great pity it is that in terms of the notion of language, that we take a word and we abuse it, that it loses all sorts of sense of meaning, because once we start talking about systems in the sense that you've been saying of the real world, we talk about pension systems, we talk about railroad systems, without any real sense of what that might mean in terms of the way our mind works and how then we deal with issues. I'm hoping that, sorry, go on.
Can I just leave your listeners with one other idea? The idea of engaging with the world and engaging with situations sit through the concept of system is a really powerful way of understanding the systemic dynamics, the relational dynamics that cause the problems we have. And so the concept system is extremely powerful if you pursue it systemically.
If this was actually visual rather than just audio, people would have seen me nodding my head all the way through as you've been talking. Ray, I hope we can meet again in this medium ere too long, and thank you so much. And thank you all for listening, and I hope to join you all again soon in another conversation in our theme of getting to better together. Until then, goodbye.